In the meanwhile, I will introduce you to Paul, and I suspect that he will introduce Lloyd as we proceed here. Paul Nathanson, Ph.D., is a retired researcher in religious studies. With Katherine Young, he wrote a landmark series of 4 books from McGill Queen's University Press on ideological feminism and its cultivation of misandry and ideological and political purposes. Spreading Misandry, the Teaching of Contempt for Men in the Popular Culture, 2001. Legalizing Misandry, from Public Shame to Systemic Discrimination Against Men, that was 2006. And then we have Sanctifying Misandry, Goddess Ideology and the Fall of Men, 2011. My, you've been busy. And Replacing Misandry, A Revolution History of Men, 2015. Paul Nathanson, welcome. You'll be joining Lloyd Robertson here as soon as we can get your camera and your video, or sorry, your camera and your audio going.
While Paul is getting set up, I'll mention that I'm now, and this was not my case before when I talked at the 2019 conference. I'm now president of the New Enlightenment Project. Now, that project is an initiative developed just this last year to defend and refine Enlightenment values from an attack that the previous speaker, William Collins, actually mentioned from wokeism. So that's where I'm coming from. Now, as you mentioned, here I think Paul is joining us.
Oh, there we are. Well, congratulations, Lloyd. I'll hand it over to Paul and give you to the platform.
Okay, well, I'll just mention that I'm really delighted to have been asked to interview Paul, because I've admired him and his work for a long time. And as you've mentioned, along with Katherine Young, they popularized, no, you didn't mention this, but I'll mention it. They popularized the word misandry in a series of 4 volumes. And they're currently working on 2 new books. The final work entitled Transcending Misandry from Feminist Ideology to Intersexual Dialogue. Paul, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Paul, I want to ask you about that anticipated final volume. But first, I want to understand how you arrived at this intellectual place. Your PhD, as Beth mentioned, is in theology. Now, that's not a discipline that automatically, at least in my mind, connotes gender studies. How did you come to have a focus on male identity?
Well, actually, my doctorate is not you. It's in religious studies, comparative religion, which is a secular discipline. I don't speak in the name of any religious tradition. So my interest was in the relation between religion and secularity. Most people would choose 2 religious traditions to compare and contrast, and I chose religion and secularity. And my general theory is that the 2 are closely related. There's a murky boundary between the 2. They're not just opposites that have nothing to do with each other. So I chose my first case study was a book on. I wrote a book on The Wizard of Oz as a secular myth of America, in which I said that, you know, the movie functions not because of anyone's intention in Hollywood, but because it just, the people in charge of making it were intuitive enough to pick up underlying strands of thought in American culture, and they represented them symbolically. So I think that the movie functions, along with several other classic movies, as a story about going home and growing up. And on the surface, it's the story of Dorothy going home and growing up, but on a deeper level, it's the story of the nation growing up and going home. And at a deeper level still, it recapitulates the classic Judeo-Christian notion of going home and growing up. So I won't get into all that now, but then I switched the focus of my study in about 1985, because that was the 10th anniversary of Vietnam. And it occurred to me that having having lived through that earlier period, I had all sorts of questions about what connection there was between being a man and being a soldier or war. I just didn't, I never understood that. And it was for 10 years, I put it out of my head because I found it too threatening. But then during the anniversary, I really decided just to do that. So I sort of interrupted my dissertation to work on that. And I got, I don't know, a few hundred pages in my private journal. And I showed it to Katherine Young, and she said, well, after you graduate, if you graduate, we should, get a grant and do some research on this, because her interest had been in women in India, in Hinduism. And I was interested in men in the West. And so we were a very good combination to, cross-culturally and historically, we could put that together in a very interesting way. And so that's how I got into the books with Katherine.
Okay, well, thank you for clarifying, first of all, that your PhD was in religious studies. Is feminism, or perhaps I should say, call it ideological feminism, is that a religion?
That's what I call a secular religion. So I started off talking about, secular myths and secular parables. But then I began to realize that these political ideologies functioned in very much the same way as traditional religions, but they were secular. They're not the same, but in many ways they function in the same way. They provide meaning and purpose. They often have scripture, the equivalent of scripture, and special sacred days and sacred places. So the whole panoply of ritual and symbol and myth, they all function in the same way, but they don't mediate the sacred. That's the one thing they don't do.
Okay. Well, religions like Christianity can be divided into fundamentalist and liberal or mainline. Do you make a similar distinction in feminism then?
Yes, and I'm really glad you asked, because, I often forget to add little details, and this happens to be a very important one. I think that, yes, from my point of view, and I think from the point of view of men in general, there are basically two kinds of feminism. One of them is egalitarian, and that was the movement that began with Betty Friedan in the early days. And I think they genuinely were interested in sexual equality. Now, I think there are some problems in the way that they began to do work on that area, because they tended to assume that equality meant the same thing as sameness, that men and women were, for all intents and purposes, except childbirth, the same. And I think that's a naive approach. But my problem with egalitarian feminism is simply a practical one. But my problem with ideological feminism is a moral problem, because I think that they really are the fundamentalist equivalent of, let's say, some groups of Protestants, for example, or you could find, or Muslims, you could find fundamentalism in almost every tradition. It's not necessarily the dominant tradition, but the possibility is always there. In any case, I think that feminists have adopted that in the sense that they do not acknowledge the possibility of ambiguity. They don't acknowledge the possibility that you need to discuss and debate and dialogue. It's simply, they have a mythology which they argue is uncontestably true, and that those who don't agree with them are either infidels, which are people who are beyond the pale, or maybe heretics who once had the true faith and have rejected it for one reason or another. So yes, I think that's the parallel I want to make. When I talk about feminism as a secular religion, I mean a secular form of fundamentalism.
Okay, I'm going to follow up on that in just a moment, but first, in your 2015 book, Replacing Misandry, you quote Hillary Clinton as saying, and I'm going to read the quote, "Women have always been the primary victims of war. Women lose their husbands, their fathers, their sons in combat. Women often have to flee from the only homes they have ever known. Women are often left with the responsibility alone of raising the children." What does this quote say about the role and identity of men in the United States and presumably elsewhere in the Western world?
Well, it means that men don't matter. Their suffering doesn't matter. Only women's suffering has a symbolic and political meaning. And therefore, when you talk about human suffering, you talk about it from a political point of view. How are we going to improve the lives of women? Well, it's because you convince people that only women are victims, and therefore that only women deserve the attention and the care and the compassion from society. Men don't need it, which is false. I just think that's false, demonstrably false, actually. It's not just my contention. The statistics certainly don't indicate that.
Would you classify Hillary Clinton then as an ideological feminist?
Oh, I don't know how to classify her. I think she makes use of whatever is at hand for her purposes. I think she's basically interested in her own career, in power, and she'll use or she'll appeal to whatever group she can. I don't think that I'm not aware that she's ideologically committed.
We heard earlier today Robert Whitley talk about a lack of empathy, and the Clinton quote seems to, as you just said, indicate a lack of empathy. Is this based on what? Male invisibility, or the last speaker, William Collins, was talking about it started with a biological imperative. What's your take on this?
Well, I didn't see the whole performance of Collins, so I can't really say. But I think that the invisibility of men is a combination of many factors. The most obvious one is simply that men have been taught, at least in this culture and probably many others, not to complain, not to whine, but to be independent and strong so that they can fulfill one function, which is basically, or several functions of men, and that is to be, let's say, the providers, people. So you don't want men to grow up always depending on the state or on compassion of society. You want them to be self-motivated, whether it's in the boardroom or on the battlefield, or in the bedroom for that matter.
I'm glad you added that. As I think you're aware, I have published research on the stigmatization of men. Now, is misandry the same thing as stigmatization, or is it something different?
Well, of course, I don't know your precise definition of stigmatization, but certainly misandry does stigmatize. So to that extent, yes, there's a real parallel. Misandry is something that I think flows from another phenomenon, which I find even in egalitarian feminism, and that is gynocentrism. It's the idea that history, all of history, the world, life, revolves around the special needs and problems of women. Now, out of that, you get some people who draw the conclusion that, well, the needs and problems of women are all caused by men. That's where you come into misandry.
Yeah, I would think that stigmatization has a somewhat different perspective, but we won't get into that because this interview is about you, of course, not me. In your 2006 book, Legalizing Misandry, you state, ideological intolerance is already rampant in the university and has been during the entire period of affirmative action. In this conformist and censorious atmosphere, not many university teachers actually encourage independent thought that is based on critical analysis of fashionable political ideologies. On the contrary, many encourage students to stamp out whatever can be classified as politically incorrect. Now, you wrote those words, or you and Katherine wrote those words 15 years ago.
Yes, that's right.
In what ways has this ideology of cancel culture changed since then, or has it?
Well, I don't think it's changed. I mean, wokeism is just another word for what existed then. We called it identity politics or political correctness, but in fact, that was the matrix, the origin of what we now call feminism. And wokeism. So it has a history of at least 50 years. It's been incubated in the universities, but it went mainstream quite some time ago. And I would say, 5 or 6 years ago, just during the Me Too movement and ever after, it's been increasingly virulent. And I use the word virulent with its Latin etymology from the word man, with care. It's not new, it's been there. And in fact, you can look back historically and find various periods throughout history in which there were similar phenomena. So we now have a series of, mind viruses or moral panics, and they're coming with increasing frequency. No sooner has society recovered from one than another one begins. But in each of these episodes, whether it was the witch trials or maybe the McCarthy period, so the name of the enemy sometimes changes, but the mentality remains the same. It's just a matter of finding a target that is convenient. And so what the phenomenon is, at least partly, it's projecting your own fear onto a group of people. I'm not a psychologist. I don't analyze that in psychoanalytical detail, but that's basically what I'm saying.
Okay, thank you. Now, in your forthcoming book, Transcending Misandry, this book, as I understand it, will advocate intersexual dialogue. In fact, that's in your title. Now, feminists have not felt a need to engage in such dialogue in the past. What would incentivize them to engage in such dialogue in the future?
Well, first of all, for various reasons, that book, which is basically written, has not yet, we haven't yet published that, and I'm not sure that we're going to in the near future. And in a sense, it's just as well, because we are as remote from intersexual dialogue as we are from, I don't know, peace in the Middle East, or, I mean, it is so remote that even preparing for it is a difficult task. And that's not due only to feminists, that's due to the whole wokist mentality, which permeates culture at every level. So I think that it's a method. It's not just we developed it not just as a nice sounding ideal, as a synonym for conversation or national debate, which are terms that I hear all the time. We developed it as a systematic approach with rules. It's a method. And we outline 10 principles, what we call the Decalogue of Dialogue. And they amount to, it sounds pretentious, but they basically amount to a combination of common decency and common sense. If you're going to be able to talk to people, you have to have a mentality that is open to that conversation instead of just ranting at the other. So it is a possibility. I developed it because I had done work in Jewish Christian dialogue, which I think was not particularly successful. I mean, it was successful at the higher ecclesiastical levels, but when it came to the level of ordinary people, yeah, they gathered in synagogue basements and church basements and had nice conversations. But I mean, it didn't amount to anything much. And the reason, I think, was because not everybody found it necessary. It was a nice thing to do, but the secular state, Canada, is what guarantees religious freedom. We don't need the goodwill of Jews or Christians. So there wasn't the urgent need for it. And I think that one of the things that I noticed was that the Jews in particular came because they wanted to tell Christians about themselves, but they didn't necessarily want to hear about Christianity. They found that threatening. And historically, they had good reason, but nevertheless. So I developed something much more rigorous out of that experience, something that could be put into use, not just between men and women, but between blacks and whites, or Anglos and Francos, or any groups in conflict.
Now, regardless of whether or not we ever get to the stage of having this intersexual dialogue, we do need, as I think you've written already, we need to develop the male identity, which has been damaged. Our identity as a protector and provider, emphasizing things like strength, courage, and bravery, this has all been diminished. On what can we build this new identity that is distinctive, necessary, and publicly valued?
Good. Thank you for mentioning those three criteria, because identity, a healthy identity, in my opinion, must have at least those three qualities, particularly public value. In other words, it's all very well for any individual to form a nice identity, but to have a collective identity is by definition to interact with and contribute to the larger society. So if you can't contribute anything, then you cannot have a healthy identity. And therefore, for the people who cannot do that, they will abandon a society without room for men. They might abandon it by committing suicide, or by dropping out of school and becoming an underclass. They might do it through drugs or crime or what have you, but they essentially abandon a society that does not care about them, that is indifferent to them. And I think that's what we're seeing.
Okay, but I'm still not clear.
Oh, yes.
How do we develop that identity?
Yes. Well, okay. So I think that over many centuries, we're talking about, in one of our books, we went back, about 10 to 12,000 years to the agricultural revolution, which was the beginning of many, many things that we now are just essential parts of our lives. It's the beginning of the rise of cities, the rise of hierarchy, the rise of warfare, because you could store food and people could raid it, or you could go and raid other people. So agriculture was a fundamental change in the human condition, I would say. Now, over the centuries, we've had a series of technological and cultural revolutions. The most obvious recent one would be the Industrial Revolution, but we have others, biological revolution and so on, computer technology. But the one that nobody else talks about, and I think is very important, is what I call the military revolution. And by that, I mean not simply the development of new military technologies, but a fundamental change in the social contract between men and women and the state. And it began really during the French Revolution with universal conscription, but not universal, really universal male conscription. Now that meant that if you were willing to fight and possibly die for the state, for the revolutionary state, then you could be a full citizen of the new society. But if you were not willing or able to do that, then you were also not quite a full citizen. So one of the things that happened was that to be a man, by definition, came to mean being a soldier for the state. And that wasn't exactly a new phenomenon, but it was new in many ways. I mean, men had always been soldiers, but not necessarily in conscript armies. Most people had to produce food in the fields. So there was a limited, amount of their time and energy that could be diverted into warfare. The people who became the warrior class were the aristocrats. Now, so I think that by this time, the notion of men as providers and as protectors has been severely attenuated because the state has simply replaced men. The state is a surrogate man, a surrogate husband, and a surrogate man. Women can do both of those things, if not by themselves as individuals, then with help from the state. Now, the one thing that remains, one of the classic and essential features of manhood that has not yet been replaced is fatherhood. And fatherhood, I must say, is really under threat at the moment, because for many reasons, partly because the definition of fatherhood tends to be sort of assistant motherhood at best. At worst, it's a potential molester. So when I talk to young men about what it means to be a father, they often say things, oh, well, I play with my children, I do the diapers, I do this, I do that. But none of these things actually is a defining feature of fatherhood. I mean, apart from the teaspoonful of sperm, what is it to be a father? And I argue that it's not the same as being a mother. It's not about infant care. It's something that grows in importance as children grow up and prepare to leave the home. They enter the larger world and they need something that fathers have given them, and that is, well, let me put it another way. Mothers give their children unconditional love, okay? I'm sure that Adolf Hitler's mother would have said, I will love you no matter what you do. I don't just, you're my son, therefore I love. But a father doesn't say that. He might feel it, but he doesn't say it. What he says is, I will respect you if you earn the respect of others in the larger world, if you function honorably in the larger world. And so it has to be earned. And so that is something that children need to hear, both girls and boys, but particularly boys. And I think that when you don't have a father who does that in the home, that is linked statistically with all sorts of social pathologies and psychological pathologies. Once again, this is not my opinion. This is demonstrable. There's something that goes wrong. Children need fathers in the home, enduring presences in the home, not a passing boyfriend, not a figure on a sitcom on TV, but an enduring presence in the home.
Okay, well, that's, as you say, the research backs that up, that children do better if they have a relationship with their fathers as well as their mothers. But there's a lot of political resistance to that idea, irrespective of the research, isn't there?
Well, there is. And it's partly because, especially now, I mean, at first there was resistance from some feminists, maybe not all. I mean, many feminists will say, yes, I want a father for my children, but what does that mean? It might mean just helping out around the house. But the real resistance came from the people who argue that women should be totally independent of men, completely, utterly independent. Autonomous is the word they use. Now, never mind that makes no sense of of human existence because we are a social animal, and that means that we're all interdependent. But just apart from that consideration, which means that autonomy is basically a utopian ideal that makes no sense in the world as we know it. But it means that some feminists resist the idea of conceding that fatherhood is an independent, not independent, that it's a necessary part of family life. And it means that they must share their authority in the home.
This whole idea of maleness is under question. Transgender activists erase the biological differences between men and women, and a person with a penis can declare himself to be a woman, thus escaping the toxic masculinity label while gaining access to female safe spaces. And as we've seen recently, things like women's sports, where they can then dominate. And some feminists, of course, are objecting.
And I agree. I agree with that.
You agree
I
with
don't
that?
agree with everything feminists say, but I do agree with that.
Oh.
The only thing I would add is that what's in danger is not only femaleness, but also maleness.
Yes. And of course, there these feminists that are putting up a resistance to that transgender ideology. They're looking to us, to you and me and all other men for support.
Yes.
What is to prevent these feminists from re-stigmatizing men or maleness once they have won this battle?
Well, I'm not a fortune teller. All I can say is that it's one thing to sympathize on an emotional level with people who feel uncomfortable in their own bodies. It's another thing to argue that children should be free to experiment with their bodies, that teachers and professionals and doctors should be free to experiment on children without the parents' consent. I mean, that's a whole other thing. That I don't agree with at all.
Now, Paul,
so that makes me, I suppose people are going to accuse me of being transphobic. And frankly, I don't care anymore. I've spent my life as a gay man being accused of homophobia. So somebody has to say these things, frankly.
okay. Now, here's my last question, and then we'll see if there's other questions from the audience. I see Beth nodding her head. My last question is this, Paul. You are religious and a self-described conservative. I, on the other hand, I am an atheist, and I'm a humanist and a lifelong social activist who's identified on the left. On what basis can we, you and I, come together to fight this common enemy?
I think the answer is obvious to both of us, and I hope to the viewers, that both of us are deeply concerned about the search for truth and the usefulness of debate and rational discourse. That unites us.
Thank you, Paul. And Beth, you'll notice that I have come full circle because I introduced myself as being someone concerned about the preservation and extension of Enlightenment values. And Paul has just said that that's what unites us.
Exactly.
Extremists on all sides.
I appreciate that you did that, Lloyd. I had it flipped in my head that Paul would be introducing you, and so you kind of didn't get your airtime on you know, your participation here this afternoon. So thank you for coming around on that, and thank you for your contributions, Paul and Lloyd. It was great to have that dialogue facilitated by yourself, Lloyd. We've got one question here, and we do actually have a break scheduled from 10 to the hour until the hour. So this will be our only question. It was submitted by David Rickberg, and he's asking about pathological feminism, meaning a feminist approach where women stand by women no matter what, but now it supports women with false claims as well. Can you discuss your experience in dealing with pathological feminism in our society today and how it affects men and their ability to access support for men by predominantly women-run organizations? So given that I just framed that with a very short window of time to address that, can you give a bit of insight there from your perspectives?
Well, I don't know about insight, but I can tell you from experience. I mean, Katherine Young and I were invited to speak at University of Toronto, or at least at a group that met at University of Toronto. And the subject on the billing was intersexual dialogue. And that was enough to bring out the protesters who refused to listen. And so basically the event was the public aspect of the event was canceled. We did say what we had to say, but we had the police escorts and all that going on at the same time. And the same thing happened at University of Ottawa. So
Right.
The whole notion of dialogue was enough to set that off. It wasn't as if we came there to talk about, male supremacy or anything like that. We just wanted to introduce the notion of dialogue.
Right. Thank you for that, Paul. Lloyd, any final closing remarks here with your great exchange with Paul?
Well, I just want to thank you for inviting me to do this interview. As I mentioned earlier, I've read all of Paul's books, and I'm looking forward to reading this future book if it is ever published, Paul.
I can show you the manuscript, Lloyd.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, gentlemen. I appreciate your time this afternoon and joining us at Momentum 2021.